Oh, guys, do you feel it? It's time to have a conversation about a kind of a difficult chapter. Oh, that's the beat. Yeah, chapter 11 on the federal bureaucracy. This is not the easiest chapter. It's not the most exciting chapter. But guys, you just stick with me. It's gonna be groovy. It's gonna be groovy. It's gonna be fine. It's gonna be fine. Hold on one second. Let me get the music out of the way now. Now, guys, welcome aboard. I hope that music got you in the right space. That's lo-fi hip-hop. That's the stuff that gets me going throughout my work day. It gets me nice and groovy. Even when things get complicated, as you can see on this screen, we're already starting out a little complicated. Some of that lo-fi hip-hop gets me in the right state of mind. So I hope you're in the right state of mind, because this chapter is called the executive branch, and we're learning about the federal bureaucracy. This is not the easiest chapter. Let me prove that right now. Let me start with a question. Define in one sentence, what is the federal bureaucracy? Do you have a good answer for me? I would wager there's a fair percentage of you that may, and the rest of us, that there's a number of us that probably don't have a great answer to that question. It is a difficult question to answer if this is kind of the first time you've been tackling some of these subjects. And in PLS 101 class, it's possible. This is the first time you've kind of tackled this conversation. So let's do it. Let's break this stuff down in a way that I can't really make some of this stuff riveting, but it is very important. It is very important. Let's go ahead and get started. Let's start off with the basic, shall we? That is, what is the bureaucracy? That's the question I asked you a moment ago. And obviously, an important question. Hopefully, over the course of this conversation, you could develop an answer to it. But let's start at the top. We can list out a textbook definition, and then on the next screen, we will. But let's start from the basics here, okay? Congress makes laws. The president signs them. Poof, that's how we get laws. Now, after laws are created, somebody needs to be in charge of turning it into action. We got to have somebody that takes the bill on paper and the law. We need to take somebody that takes a law on paper and turns it into a law in action. Guys, that's what the bureaucracy is. It is a nationwide, millions of people strong organization that takes our federal laws on paper and turns them into laws in action. Because any given law, it's not going to enforce itself. You need people to enforce it. The president's not going to enforce it because he is just a guy, and in the future, probably a woman. But what you need is a nationwide network of a lot of people working in tandem with one another to make sure that these laws are being enforced. Now, obviously, when we talk about the federal bureaucracy, which branch of government are we talking about? Do you remember the title of this chapter? It's titled The Executive Branch. So clearly when we talk about the bureaucracy, we're talking about law enforcement. We're talking about the executive branch. So kind of the title of the chapter kind of spoils that little surprise for you. But nonetheless, that's who we're talking about here. Now that we have what I hope is a base understanding of what the federal bureaucracy is, now let's circle back to the textbook definition. Here it is. Textbook definition of the bureaucracy is that it's a large organization, shocker, it's millions and millions of people strong, that is structured hierarchically to carry out specific functions. That is not the easiest definition. Can we make some sense of it, please? Do you remember the conversation we had back when we were breaking down capitalism and communism and just trying to break down the definition, figure out what the heck it's talking about? Let's do that here. A large organization structured hierarchically to carry out specific functions. Let's do the best we can to make some sense of this. So when we talk about specific functions, carrying out specific functions, essentially that means enforcing the law. I mean, the definition could be a large organization structured hierarchically to enforce the law. It could say that. I don't know why it doesn't say that, but that's what it means. That's what these specific functions are in enforcing the various parts of the law. Now, on top of that, what about this ridiculous word? Hierarchically. That's how you say it. Hierarchically. What does that word mean? Well, it means that there's a hierarchy. In other words, there's a chain of command. Looks like this in practice. There is a chain of command. Everybody in the bureaucracy answers to somebody above them. All the way, just like at your job. Where do you work? Do you work at a restaurant? Maybe you're a server at a restaurant. Well, there's a shift leader. And that shift leader answers to the branch manager. And the branch manager answers to the district manager. And the district manager, and up and up and up and go until you eventually answer to a CEO of whatever the restaurant chain is. You know, I am an instructor at OTC. I answer to my department chair. My department chair answers to the dean. The dean answers to the vice chancellor, and the vice chancellor answers to the chancellor, to Hal Higdon, the guy that runs OTC. So there, that is a totem pole, and I am nestled very comfortably at the bottom of it, as many of us are at if you work in an entry level position, or essentially OTC being an instructor, which at times feels like an entry level position. Now, with that in mind, I just noticed something. I just noticed I'm wearing a black shirt and I look like a floating torso. That is not good. That is not good dress code. Just for the record, you should, if you shoot videos in a void, you should wear colored clothes so that you appear to be a whole human being. Anyways, so what I'm trying to say here is that everybody in the bureaucracy answers to somebody higher up on the chain. And if you go high enough, you eventually get to the very tippy top. Now, if it's the restaurant you work at, it's a CEO. If it's an OTC you work at, it's the chancellor of the college. If it's the executive branch, it's the president. That, by the way, is why we put this chapter at 11, right after chapter 10, which is about the presidency. We don't just shove it in there for no reason. This whole unit is about the three branches of government, and chapter 10 and chapter 11 are two different shades of the same branch, the executive branch. All right, now I started off this slide, this lecture with a very busy screen with lots of different seals. Those seals, you notice those circles, those are organizations that all work at enforcing the law within the federal bureaucracy. So let's talk about that. There are different kinds of organizations that work in the bureaucracy. They all have their different fiefdoms, they all have their different responsibilities of enforcing American law. Now, the biggest and the baddest organizations in the federal bureaucracy are called departments. Sometimes, such as in our textbook, they are called cabinet departments. That's fine. I'll just be calling it departments, okay? So, what makes a department a department? Well, there's really kind of three elements to making a department. Element number one is they are huge, in a way that I'll kind of underline for you when we start talking about the next category. But these organizations tend to be very, very large. Some of them only have a few thousand people. The Department of Education actually has a relatively small number of people, about 10,000, give or take. But some of these organizations get really, really big. Some of these departments, I meant to say, get really, really big, which we'll talk about in just a second. But first of all, they're large organizations. They're large because they deal with broad areas of policy. They deal with broad areas of policy, such as the Department of Transportation. All transportation policy is dealt with in this department. We have a Department of Energy, anything having to do with energy. Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, Department of, like I said a moment ago, Education. You get the idea. These tend to be very broad subjects, and they need larger organizations to take care of them. Now, on top of that, they're also directly accountable to the president. And we'll kind of explain that in just a second. Anyways, they're large organizations. They deal directly with broad areas of policy and are directly accountable to the president. Now, when I say large, how large are we talking? Well, the biggest, like I said, the Department of Education is reportedly the smallest. It only has about like 9,000 to 10,000 people in it. But the Department of Defense is massive. We spend more on defense in America than like the next 20 countries combined. It's really ridiculous. And as a result, as you can imagine, you got a lot of people working in the Department of Defense. 3 million Americans work in the Department of Defense. Now they deal with, like I said, broad areas of policy. You can look at a more complete list of that on table 11.1. And I always struggle to kind of figure out the page numbers on these things. Do you guys? I always feel like with the ebook, I'm struggling to find the page numbers sometimes. But nonetheless, look at table 11.1 if you want to look at a rundown of all the different departments and what they do. There's about 15 of them, give or take. I actually forget the exact number of departments that we have. Now, they are directly accountable to the president, which, by the way, makes them line organizations. That's what that means. A line organization is an organization that is directly accountable to the president. Departments are all directly accountable to the president. That does mean that departments will function very differently. Most of them will function very differently from presidency to presidency to presidency. So some of them, like Department of Justice, is not supposed to operate that much differently, but most of them will see huge sea changes in how they enforce the law, the areas of the law they focus on. You get the idea. Now, with that in mind, departments are, like I said, the biggest organizations in the federal bureaucracy. It's not even close. And as a result, the people that run them are among the most powerful people in the federal bureaucracy. And again, we got some departments like State Department that deals entirely with diplomacy. Heard of the Secretary of State before? That is a person who's in charge of the State Department. They deal with diplomacy, reaching out to foreign nations, trying to find common ground, work out deals with them. You have the Treasury Department, handles the country's finances. You have the Education Department. You get the idea. Now, anyways, the people that run these departments, as a result, tend to be the most powerful people in the bureaucracy. Because they are running the largest organizations. So you're going to have, Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Education, and so on. They are so big and so powerful, perhaps you remember from Chapter 10, they sit on the president's cabinet. Now, we talked about also how the cabinet has seen its influence decline, but individual members can be brought into the president's inner circle all the time. So these secretaries tend to be very powerful people. Now, on top of that, they are so powerful, they do not get hired at a normal job hiring. Instead, they get appointed. Do you remember who does the appointing? Pop quiz. Who does the appointing of a person this important? Of course, it's the president. Now, clearly, this person is so important. These cabinet people are among the 20 to 30 most powerful people in the American government. And as a result, they need to not just be appointed, they need to be confirmed. Do you remember who confirms people that the president has appointed? It is the Senate. So make sure you know that, obviously, as you can see those questions surface again in the future. All right, so we're talking about organization of the federal bureaucracy. We just talked about the biggest and the baddest, and that's departments. Let's talk about a different category as well of agencies. Now, agencies is what I'll call them. They're often called independent agencies. That's fine, but I call them agencies. And just like departments, there are three things that make agencies agencies. Thing number one, they are not small, but they are smaller. Agencies are often smaller than departments. So, for instance, the Department of Homeland Security is the newest department we have. It was put together back in 2002. The Department of Homeland Security is the newest one we have, and we created it by taking essentially 20 different agencies and slapping them together into the department. So that's how much bigger departments are than agencies. But first of all, they are smaller because they deal with much more specific areas of policy. I'll give you some examples of that here in just a moment. And unlike departments, they do not necessarily march to the president's drumbeat. Now, some do, but most don't. Like, for instance, the FDA, right? The Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. Who should set policy when it comes to food and drugs? Well, we have decided in our laws that scientists and nutritionists should be in charge of that, and pharmacists, people with degrees and expertise in the area, not politicians, not even presidents or politicians, right? So the president shouldn't be running the FDA. So most agencies, like the FDA, will largely function the same, no matter who's president. Like, not every agency is that way, but the vast, vast majority of them are. Now, like I said a moment ago, these agencies are smaller because they deal with more specific areas of policy. Here are some examples. You don't need to know these examples, but if they help you out, so be it. We have an agency who exclusively funds and aids the arts in various ways, and tries to monitor the environment and deals with the handling of Social Security, and obviously tries to implement federal policy on disability services. So these agencies tend to be much more specific. And again, I'm not asking you to know these examples necessarily, but if they help you, they help you. Now, agencies, generally speaking, come in two different flavors. The first of those flavors is national security. Once again, there are two different kinds of agencies, generally speaking. The first is national security. And really, national security, I don't need to define national security for you, just keeping the country safe. And it's just any agency that's in charge of keeping the country safe from various hostile threats. That could be, for instance, the FBI, which is what you're seeing right here, the seal for the FBI. It can be the CIA. It could be the NSA, which like tracks online communications and phone records and such. It could be the TSA. The TSA, whenever you fly on a plane, they pat you down. That's what they're doing. They're trying to protect you from national security threats, national security threats, not trying to protect you from national security. All right, now with that in mind, there are two different flavors of agencies. The first we talked about is national security, but the one I want to spend a bulk of time talking about are regulatory agencies. This is a very important type of agency, and this is how the government really directly touches your life on a regular basis. Now, when we talk about regulatory agencies, we're talking about the idea of implementing rules and regulations in a specific area of your life. In a specific area, in almost every area of your life, there is a government agency, usually a federal government agency, that issues various rules and regulations that you have to follow. Keep in mind, these agencies aren't issuing laws, right? They can't do that. Instead, what they issue are regulations. Again, agencies can't create laws, only Congress can create laws. They can issue regulations. Regulations. And regulations, again, are not laws, but you have to follow them, right? If you violate a federal regulation, you can get thrown in jail. You can be sued. You can be penalized with a fine. So these regulations are not laws, but they are law-like. They are law-like rules. They have the effect of law. So why do we even have these? If we already have a Congress, why do we need all these agencies running around making rules that could punish us as well? We don't need all these things, so the theory goes. Well, let me give you an example. Again, you don't need to know this example, but hopefully it makes the issue clear to you. Let me give you an example. Starting in the 1920s. In the 1920s, we start figuring out how to fly things in the air, of course, in terms of airplanes. And eventually, these airplanes can carry things and transport people. And so Congress says, oh my goodness, now we're flying things in the air. We need to make sure that the aviation industry is regulated, and so things can be safely transported and people can be safely transported through the air. But that runs into a problem now, doesn't it? What does Congress know about making planes safe? Most of them are lawyers. Probably zero of them are engineers. So they don't know the first thing about making planes safe. That's an unfair thing to ask Congress to be specialized in. So they say, the planes need to be safe. Air travel needs to be safe. We don't know how to make it safe. So what we'll do is we'll create a regulatory agency known as the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, and its job specifically is to do this. Like, we're going to point at plane safety and say, FAA, do that, please. Please make plane travel safe, please. And so Congress has no idea what they're doing, so they've just empowered. We call this enabling legislation. They've enabled the FAA to make a bunch of rules that the rest of us have to follow. Now, you and I don't have to follow a bunch of flying regulations, but certainly airlines do. There are regulations on flight inspections, pilot certificates, air traffic control, environmental factors. Now, if you're going to operate an airline and make money off an airline here in America, you gotta follow those rules. Okay. By the way, OTC still has a relatively new aviation program. If you're interested in being a pilot someday, I suggest you invest. Okay, so with that in mind, FAA issues a bunch of regulations to make air travel safe. And guess what? Now, like, air travel is the safest way to travel, right? Are trains? Who's safer, trains or planes? Trains or planes are pretty safe. But I know planes are a lot safer than a car. So that's just speaks to the success of the FAA. All right, now we will circle back on agencies and regulations here in a minute because we have something important to talk about in that regard. But at the end of the day, we're still talking about organization of the federal bureaucracy. We've talked about departments, we've talked about agencies. Let's take some time to talk about government corporations. Government corporations, this is another type of organization in the federal bureaucracy, and it's a little bit of a different bird than the other two. Essentially, it's a government agency that runs a quasi-business. A quasi-business, and you're never going to see that prefix, quasi, anywhere else in this class. So if you ever see something on an exam or a test or anything like that, and it says, what's a quasi-business center? You could say, well, okay, well, that's a government corporation. And essentially, what we're talking about here is, it's a business. It's a business being run by the government. It's not being run by private individuals like you or I. It's being run by the government. Okay, now, these things theoretically don't have to exist. Like, you need the Department of Defense to defend America, right? You need the FBI and the FDA to make sure that we're safe from various things that can hurt us or harm us. Like, you need those things. You theoretically don't need government corporations, but the government just thinks whatever these corporations are doing is so important, it created its own option for you, the consumer, to take advantage of. The classic example, you know I normally tell you that you don't need to know examples. Well, this is an example you do need to know. The best example of a government corporation is what? Come on, hit me. Hit me. I can't hear you. It's almost like you're a camera that can't talk to me. Okay? That's inappropriate. You should talk to me when I ask you a question. But anyways, the best known example right here on my face is that's not very good PowerPointing, no, is it? But the Postal Service, right? The Postal Service is a classic example of a government corporation. This is a business. You go and you pay for stamps. You pay to have things mailed. That's what you do. Now, you don't pay very much, and theoretically, if we didn't have the Postal Service, you could still mail things. You could still use other private businesses to ship your mail for you. You could do that. But the government's like, no, mailing things, even in 2021, is still really, really important. I think most people still pay their bills by mail. I think that's accurate. And as a result, the Postal Service, they just think that's too important of an option. You should have a government option in that industry. Now, it is not the only government corporation out there. Here's some other examples. These examples you don't need to know. But there'd be examples like the FDIC. This is something that makes sure that banks are properly insuring. This is an insurance company that the government runs and insures your deposits in the bank, all the way up to what? I want to say $125,000, I think, but I don't really know because I don't have that kind of money. Now, on top of that, do you ever watch PBS or OPT? Do you ever listen to NPR, 91.1 FM, 91.1 FM? Highly recommended because NPR is awesome. But anyways, these are all private industries. I'm sorry, these are all businesses being run by, in a public industry. They're all being run. Can I just start over with that sentence, please? These three things, plus Unicor, are all businesses being run by the government. Unicor employs prisoners to do various jobs. If you are of good health, you are compelled by law to do some work. We're not paying you really much at all. We'll talk about that more in Chapter 5 when we talk about civil rights some. But nonetheless, these are all businesses, essentially corporations, that are run by the government, making them government corporations. Told you we're not very creative when it comes to naming things. Now, I told you a moment ago that I wanted to cut back to agencies, so let's do that. Let's cut back to agencies, especially these regulatory agencies. Because as I was telling you, these regulatory agencies are in charge of making sure that the various avenues in our life are well regulated and they're set up with rules that make sense and benefit our lives. We can kind of just depend on them to give us all the answers and make sure things are okay. They're like Janet of the good place. That's what we're gunning for here. That's what these agencies need to be, is they need to be Janet. We can just rely on them to take care of their particular area. Okay? The problem is that agencies aren't always competently run. They're not always Janets. Sometimes they're Dereks from The Good Place. For those of you that haven't watched The Good Place, Derek is the not good version. It's not that he's evil. He just kind of sucks at his job. He's just not very good at it. And so what happens if an agency is not very good at what they're doing? What do we do if an agency kind of stinks? Because keep in mind, if the president kind of stinks, we can vote him out. If Congress kind of stinks, we can vote him out. But agencies aren't regulated, now are they? Their top positions are appointed. That's it. But the vast majority of the people that work in the bureaucracy are not elected. And they're not even appointed. They're hired just like you and I are hired for a job. So if they're doing a bad job, if the agency as a whole kind of stinks, what can we do to get them on the straight and narrow? Who do we put in charge of that? Well, we put Congress in charge of reeling in agencies if they get out of hand. I like Janet. I wish I had a Janet. Janet, can I do that right now like it's The Good Place? Janet, yes? Oh, show me my next slide. All right, so anyways, Congress has two ways to reel them in if they're getting out of hand. One of those ways is what we call power of the purse. Congress has power of the purse. That means they control funding. They control all the funding of the federal government and the lack of funding. That is all on Congress's shoulders. That's in the Constitution. So if Congress likes the work that an agency is doing, such as our good friend Janet over here, they can fund that agency more. If they don't like the job an agency is doing, they can threaten to strip their funding altogether or at least reduce their funding. So normally, coming for your paychecks is a pretty good way of getting these agencies to see the straight and narrow. That's usually a pretty good way to make sure that these agencies are paying attention and serving the public interest as Congress kind of demands. Now, for the record, sometimes agencies, like Derek for that matter, can be kind of cantankerous, and even if you slash their funding, they ain't going to stop doing what they're doing. So if that's the case, Congress does have the ability to make laws. And laws can override, they trump whatever regulations that exist. So earlier in the semester, I kind of wrote you a totem pole of constitutional power. You have the Constitution as the ultimate political power in America. Then you have the Supreme Court right after that, and lower courts after them. Then there are laws and executive orders. And regulations. That's not very good handwriting, sorry about that, but regulations. So laws can trump regulations. For the record, so can executive orders. But you know, Congress is specifically the party that we entrust to trump these regulations if the president doesn't get on it. All these things can boss around the lower thing, but they can't boss around the upper thing, right? So obviously, if we don't like the regulations that we have, we can out-legislate them. Now, maybe you don't know much about the federal bureaucracy, but you've heard of that word before, the bureaucracy, and everybody kind of moans about it all the time, about how, well, you know, various complaints about why the bureaucracy stinks. I think even if you don't know much about the federal bureaucracy, you're aware of the fact that it is widely criticized for various reasons. There's any number of reasons why the federal bureaucracy is criticized, but we can talk about two of the main complaints. Now, one of the biggest complaints about the federal bureaucracy is that it is bloated and huge. And that's hard to argue. I mean, hard to argue against is what I'm trying to say. Because, I mean, look at this. Unfortunately, this is not updated past, I don't think this is updated past the Obama administration. But rest assured, under the Trump administration, and currently, as we speak, under the Biden administration, these lines continue upward. And so you can see how the federal bureaucracy is growing and growing from presidency to presidency. It doesn't matter if it's a Democratic presidency or a Republican presidency, the bureaucracy continues to grow. And that's an area of complaint that a lot of people seem to have with it. But I just want to let you know, it is growing like this, not for no reason. There's reasons why the federal bureaucracy keeps expanding, keeps on growing. And one of those is because we have new science and technology. As we develop new science, as we develop new technology, there need to be new regulations to deal with these things. I mean, we're coming up with clones now. We can clone things now. And so long as we clone things, well, let's put cloning away and let's talk about droning, since drones, that rhymes and it's more relevant. We see drones every day, all the time. Prior to drones being mainstream, there really were no government regulations about them. The FAA had no regulations about regular drones. What happens when Amazon and Pizza Hut start delivering stuff through the air? What should the regulations be? Well, as we develop new technology and new science, there need to be new regulations to deal with those areas, or at least many people believe there should be. So one reason the bureaucracy continues to grow is because of new science and new technology. Another reason it tends to grow is because of business regulation. Again, that plays right into technology. Technology is allowing businesses to do more things, do new things, and sometimes act in ways that are unexpected by law and as a result are completely unregulated. So that's one of the reasons. If you have those regulations in place, sometimes you're going to introduce these regulations. You're going to need new regulators out there and about making sure that they are being followed. Another reason the federal bureaucracy continues to grow is because of the social safety net. You know, our population is growing. As the population grows, a certain percentage will be mired in poverty, unfortunately, and as a result, as the population grows, that population will grow as well, and the social safety net expands to accommodate these people. Also, there are new ways that we try to tool up the social safety net. Right now, the Biden administration is working on a piece of legislation that will grant tuition-free community college. Obviously, that's relevant to our interests, but if they're tuition-free community college would be a version of the social safety net. In addition to that, there is also millions of people that work in the federal bureaucracy, and all the people in the top brass are addicted to the authority. Addicted's the wrong word, but they enjoy the authority they get. Many of them try to expand their authority within the bureaucracy. Their combined efforts may contribute to the expansion of the federal bureaucracy. You can nickname them ambitious administrators, if you will. I'll give you one moment to catch up. Put on some music when I'm waiting, right? I closed that screen, otherwise I would have music going. Okay, so first of all, the federal bureaucracy is bloated. That is a complaint that we have about the federal bureaucracy, and as we've seen, it's not an easy problem to solve because it grows for definitive reasons. In addition to that, people also complain about the fact that the federal bureaucracy seems to be wasteful and inefficient. And fair criticism, fair. However, while the federal bureaucracy probably could be more efficient, it probably could be less wasteful with its efforts, one thing we'll learn is that it's like that for a reason. And I'll kind of show this to you. I'll illustrate it for you by comparing how the bureaucracy would ideally work in a perfect world where the streets are paved with milk and honey. That doesn't make any sense. But anyways, and I'll compare it to how the federal bureaucracy actually functions. Okay, so by comparing how it could be with how it actually is, we'll see why the federal bureaucracy is often wasteful and inefficient. Now, one reason why it's wasteful, and I'm sorry, one reason, let me start over. One way that the federal bureaucracy could operate in a perfect world is that every agency knows exactly what it needs to be doing. It's given a clear, understandable goal that it never deviates from. In a perfect world, that would work extremely positively for an agency. It would always know exactly which way is its north. Now, on top of that, an agency immediately decides how to best achieve that goal. You give us a job, we know what our job is, that's great. Well, now we know exactly the best way to enforce this law, which is great because in a perfect world, there's really no limitations to how we can enforce this sucker. So the agency is given a clear, understandable goal and knows immediately the best way to enforce it. And there's no limitations, nothing holding any of its efforts back. But of course, that's not how the world actually works. And by comparing a perfect world to the actual world, you can see why this bureaucracy is sometimes wasteful and inefficient. In a perfect world, an agency's goals are clear and understandable. That is not always the case. Many agencies have vague goals or conflicting goals, or their goals change radically from president to president. And if that is the case, the agency is going to be constantly zigzagging, chasing its own tail, playing problem whack-a-mole, trying to solve every problem, and new problems pop up because their goals are oftentimes contradictory, vague, or they flip and flop around. Now, what about in the perfect world where, when you give it a mission to accomplish, the agency immediately knows the best way to solve that issue? Again, that is not the case because agencies operate just like you and I, through trial and error. Educated trial and error. They hope they do the best job possible. But trial and error is the name of the game, and with an emphasis on the error. Really, the way most policies work, there are very few policies, very few laws, very few regulations, very few executive orders that are all good or all bad. Most of these regulations, most of these laws do a fair amount of good, and they do a fair amount of negative side effects. And so hopefully you implement some issue, you circle back, you examine how you fell short, and then you give it another try and try to fix that issue. We'll talk about that more in chapter 13. On top of that, what about in accomplishing your goal, there are no limitations? Well, of course, that's not the case either, because agencies constantly have limitations on the things that they do. For instance, they only have a budget of so much money. They can't do everything they want to do because they have to shuffle the money around just like the rest of us do. So they have to make ends meet the best that they possibly can. Now, on top of that, you also have a certain amount of resources, a certain amount of manpower, a certain amount of physical space and enforcement abilities. Sometimes they only have so much time. Like if you're only giving me 6 months to accomplish a massive task, I might not do the best job of that task, because if you gave me like 3 years to accomplish it, I could be a lot more thorough, a lot more careful. If you're only giving me 6 months, relatively speaking, I got to cut some corners or kind of do the most expedient course of action. Some agencies are limited legally, and that keeps them from doing the best possible job that they could do. This is something that the ATF talks about quite a bit. Actually, I think it's the ATFE now. ATF, that's alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and explosions. The ATFE, well, that's not very good. I wrote that there. But regardless, the ATFE is in charge of regulating alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and explosives, which is all fine and good. One of the purviews of their job is to find people that sell guns illegally. If you're selling guns illegally. Now, the ATF has said that is very easy for them to do if they can create a database of all gun sales in America. If they can create a database of all gun sales in America, then the 1% of people that are selling guns illegally will be extremely easy to track down. All right, fair enough, except as many of the gun owners listening to this might feel, it might feel a little queasy with the idea that there's a government tracking all gun sales in America. However, as a result, Congress has passed a law saying that the government can't do that. The ATF cannot do that. As a result, that is a way that the ATF is limited. They have to find another way to track down people who are selling guns illegally. Okay, so why is the bureaucracy wasteful and inefficient? Is it because there are a bunch of fat cats who can't do their job? I can't paint with a broad brush. There might be a few in there that fit that description, but mostly it's because their job can be very complicated and politically complicated and actually limited in many ways. So if that's the case, if we have if we have a bureaucracy that is growing aggressively and can be wasteful and inefficient, what ways can we solve our problem here? Well, we can talk about different reform ideas with the federal bureaucracy. Let's talk about a few. Now, if you happen to be more conservative politically, then deregulation is a pretty good, interesting solution to you. And this is an idea that if we don't like how the government is regulating us, we could just have the government do less regulation, right? We call that deregulation. Give the bureaucracy less responsibility. We now are living under the Biden administration, but before the Biden administration, we had the Trump administration. The Trump administration was gung-ho about deregulation of many different kinds of industries. Deregulation, a conservative idea that generally favors giving the bureaucracy less responsibility. Now, on top of that, we also have sunshine laws. There are several sunshine laws, and you could always pass more sunshine laws, and they force many agencies to conduct their business in public. And by forcing them to do that, you could theoretically have 300 million eyeballs on you. Now, of course, you and I are not watching these agencies doing their business in public, but there are watchdogs and there are media outlets that watch this for us and alert us if things are awry or if they deem things to be awry. So these sunshine laws, the whole idea is that by forcing these agencies to conduct their business in public, there will be fewer shenanigans and they can theoretically work harder to do a good job, feeling the pressure of the public watching them. Now, don't confuse sunshine laws with sunset laws. They both have sun in it, but they are different. Sunset laws will sunset. They will close the amount of time. They'll only fund an agency for a certain amount of time. When that funding runs out, you have been sunsetted. And so the idea is when that sunsetting is around the corner, agencies will come begging Congress, please give us more money for us to continue existing, please. Now, in making that sales pitch to Congress, they will theoretically make the case that they have been responsible, they've been effective, they haven't been wasteful, they have not contributed to the growth of the bureaucracy. Look how much better we've made things on such and such fronts. So that's one way to whip these agencies into shape, theoretically. Another is if you are a believer that the private businesses are better at doing a job than the government, you can take government responsibilities and sell it off to a private business. We call that privatization, which I like that term, tells you exactly what it means. But privatization means we take government jobs and we have private businesses do it under contract with the federal government, often called private contractors. This can be controversial from time to time. For instance, there is a national debate right now raging about private prisons. Many of the prisons we have here in America are not public prisons. They're not operated by the government, but instead operated by a private business. You imagine being imprisoned by a private business, but a private business that gets the contract to run that prison on behalf of the federal government. There has been some reporting that the conditions of these private prisons are not up to snuff because they do not have to meet all the government regulations that government prisons have to meet. And so there has been some movement about reforming or potentially even getting rid of them. Another reform of the bureaucracy is protecting the people in the bureaucracy when they tell us something's awry. That we call those people whistleblowers, because like a referee, when they're crying foul, tweet, they're letting us know that something has been violated here. There has been really bad inefficiency, or somebody's doing illegal action, or somebody's corrupt. So these whistleblowers, when they come public, can be punished. We call that retribution, when somebody in a position of power punishes a whistleblower. And so we have laws that are designed to protect whistleblowers if they come forward. That being said, that means if you are a whistleblower in America, you will be protected. We will not turn on you, right? This guy might disagree. This is Edward Snowden, who blew the whistle on the NSA. Said that the NSA was, supposed to be tapping the phone lines of bad guys. He is arguing and has argued that actually the NSA is tapping everybody's phone lines. He came forward this accusation about a decade or so ago. As a result, the whistleblower laws failed to protect him. The Obama and Trump and now the Biden administrations have all tried to go get him. He's currently in Russia right now and hiding. He's not in America. So obviously the federal government has a long way to go. And that's a problem because he is a whistleblower. We have passed laws here in America based on the information he revealed. So he's done us a public service. But sadly, no pardons, no protection for Edward Snowden. I don't want to say sadly because he's a complicated person. He's not some white knight, but nonetheless, that was a public service he performed. All right, guys, like I said, that is a not the brightest and most entertaining chapter, but we use this chapter as a catapult from which we can dive into the third branch of government, the judicial branch. And stuff gets a little weird in the judicial branch, so I look forward to talking about that with you. In the meantime, if you have any questions, hit me up, shoot me an email. I'd love to help you and clarify anything I might have said in this presentation. Thank you so much.